Okay, time to put a cast shadow on my deer to make them look more realistic and grounded in reality. All right, here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to go to my original deer and make sure I'm on that original deer in the layers palette. Next, I'm going to duplicate that deer. Except I'm not going to click it and drag it because I want the deer to stay exactly where it is. So instead, I'm going to right click on that layer that I want to duplicate, and on the pop-up, choose Duplicate Layer. You could do the same exact thing by going to Layer, Duplicate Layer. So two ways to do it. Choose the layer in the Layers palette and go up top to Layer, Duplicate Layer, or you can right click on the layer in the Layers palette and choose Duplicate Layer. All right, so notice in my Layers palette, I'm going to call this Big Deer, and my duplicated copy, I'm going to call it Big Deer Shadow. All right, and I'm even going to hide the small deer just so it doesn't get in the way, okay? So here's my two layers, the big deer and the big deer shadow. They are right on top of each other. You can see if I move them, there they are, they're both there. All right, now for the big deer shadow, I'm going to change it to a black silhouette. Let's go to Image, Adjustments, Hue, Saturation again. Image Adjustments, Hue, Saturation. And this time I'm not going to adjust the hue. I'm going to take the lightness bar and slide it all the way to black, so that I've changed that deer into a black silhouette. All right, that was Image, Adjustments, Hue, Saturation. And I took the lightness slider all the way to black. All right, now this deer, right now the shadow is on top of the deer. That's okay for now. We're gonna move it in a minute. Right now I want to adjust this black silhouette so that it is slanting onto the ground like a real cast shadow. I'm gonna go to Edit, Transform, Distort. Edit, Transform, Distort. All right, now from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the center box right there on the outer bounding box. I'm going to take the center one. Depending on your light source, now think about, where's your light source coming in this photograph? Where's the sun or where's the moon? Your shadow is opposite the light source. All right, so wherever you think the light source is, pull that center little box to the left or to the right opposite your light source. All right, pull it to the left or the right. Then drag it straight down. Okay, now the other thing about shadows is, in reality, if the sun is really bright and really high, like it's noon time, your shadow will be very dark and very hard edged and kind of small. But if it's, morning time or sunset time when the light is a little softer and the sun is, higher in the sky, then your shadow will be lighter, more transparent, maybe soft edged, and also longer. All right, I'm going to hit enter to get out of the bounding box. Now notice my shadow sort of overlapping the ridge. That's okay at this point. What I'm going to do is reduce the opacity of this layer to make my shadow see-through. All right, so I'm on the shadow layer in the layers palette. Notice right here at the top of the layers palette, it says opacity 100%. That means that the black silhouette is opaque. It's 100% not see-through. I want to reduce the opacity. I'm going to drop down that little arrow and look at what happens if I go down to 50%. Now that shadow is see-through. I change the opacity. It's transparent. If you want it to be a little bit more visible, increase your opacity. I'm going to do about 65%. Okay, now notice the shadow is overlapping the deer. That is not correct in reality. So in my layers palette, I'm going to drag the shadow layer below the real deer. So now that it's below the real deer in the layers palette, now it's behind the deer. That makes more sense. Also, I'm going to zoom in and make sure the feet line up. All right, the feet sort of line up, but I'm going to move this a little bit, make sure the feet line up better. All right, so I've reduced the opacity a little bit, but I think I'm going to reduce it some more. So I'm going back to my opacity, reducing that opacity, making the shadow more transparent. Okay, and also it's very hard edged. I want the edge of my shadow to be softer. And what I'm going to do now is use a filter. Let's take a look at our filters. I'm going to use a filter that blurs the edges of this shadow. Up at the top menu, I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. I'm going to get a little pop-up box that shows me part of the deer. My hand is going to pop up. I'm going to sort of just move the image around so I can see more of it. And now it's giving me a preview. Double check that this little box right here is checked for preview. And I can see if I increase the radius of my pixels, I can see how much it's blurring the edges. So if you do too much, it'll blur it away. Now it's gone. All right, so don't do too much. I'm only going to increase the pixels a couple of pixels to blur the edges. And I'll click OK. All right, so there's my shadow looking much more realistic. All right, I can use my navigator right here and zoom out a little bit. Okay, and there's my deer with its shadow. All right, I'm going to do that again for the small deer. There's the small deer. All right, once again, let's repeat how to do that cast shadow. I'm going to duplicate this deer. All right, so in my layers palette, I'm going to call it small deer. Okay, one more time. So now I'm on the small deer layer. So if I turn on and off the eyeball, you can see there it is. That's the layer. And I'm going to duplicate the small deer. Layer, duplicate layer. All right, it's going to be called copy. I'm going to call it small deer shadow. Okay, so now I've got that layer in my layers palette, the small deer shadow. Time to turn this into a black silhouette. Image, adjustments, hue, saturation. All right, in my hue saturation box, I'm going to take that lightness slider all the way to black. Turn it into a black silhouette. Click OK. Time to distort it. Edit, transform, distort. All right, once again, I'm going to use the top middle box. That's what I'm going to pull on. And just like my other deer, I'm going to say that the light source is coming from the left, so the shadow is going to go right. I'm going to take that middle box, pull to the right, and then pull down. All right, I'll hit enter. I'm going to zoom in. I can tell that the feet got misaligned, so time to move those a little bit. Now, if, like me, the distortion made the feet too close together, they're not really matching up, you could warp it. I'm going to go to Edit, Transform, Warp. Edit, Transform, Warp. And I'm only going to try to pull just the feet. I don't want to warp the whole shadow, just the feet. Just going to get those lined up. Real small adjustment. And hit Enter. All right, time to make that shadow look more realistic. I'm going to reduce the opacity of the deer shadow layer. So I'm on the deer shadow layer in the layers palette. Right here in the layers palette where it says opacity 100% for the deer shadow, I'm going to reduce that down. Okay, I'm going to do about the same as I did for the other shadow, about 60. All right, next I'm going to blur it again. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Okay, blurred it a little bit. All right, right now in my layers palette, the shadow is on top of the deer. It needs to be below it. So I'm going to click and grab that and drag it below the deer so that the shadow is below the deer in the layers palette. All right, use my navigator, zoom out a little bit, and now you can see both of my deer have a cast shadow. And then comparing them, I can see, oh, you know what? The big shadow is a little more transparent. Let's go ahead and alter that small shadow transparency, the opacity. Let's reduce it some more so it's more see-through like the big deer. Okay, that's making